I'm going to show you how to make a puff quilt just like this.
But I'm going to show you the easier way to make it that also saves materials, saves money, and saves time. I wanted mine to be a little more scrappy looking, so I used a bunch of different fabrics and I made an oversized throw. So I ended up with 195 5-inch squares. And one of the benefits of this method that I'm showing you here is that you don't need those backing squares like you see in the other tutorials. So there is no wasted fabric. After you have your fabric cut into 5-inch squares, you're gonna lay it out and just make a giant patchwork quilt top the same way that you would make any other quilt top. You can obviously do any pattern or design that you want, but I do recommend adding a couple rows on each side because in the next step, this quilt top will shrink down quite a bit and it'll be a lot harder to add them after this. Once your quilt top is all sewn together and a little bit bigger than you want it to be when it's finished, we're gonna take it back to the sewing machine and go over each line again, pinching a 1/4 inch and pleating every side of every square. Just like you see me doing here, you're gonna go up every column and across every row to make sure that every single square has 4 pleats when it's finished. Now your quilt top should be looking something like this, and it is time to attach the backing. You're gonna lay your backing right side up and then lay your quilt top right side down so the right sides are together. And once everything is straightened out so there are no creases or folds in either the backing or the quilt top, you're gonna go around with your safety pins or clips and pin all of the sides in place so they don't move in the next step when we take it over to the sewing machine and sew essentially a giant U shape around the outside of the quilt, leaving one of the short sides open for later. Once that's done, flip it inside out. This is what you should be looking like right now. And what we're about to do next is another reason why this quilt is so much easier than those other tutorials you've seen. We are going to go around the edges and sew a top stitch in that same giant U shape so we don't have to put binding on later. I promise we are so close to actually adding the puffs to this quilt, but first we have to pin everything in place so nothing moves in this next step where we take it back to the sewing machine and sew up the columns about the length of 3 rows. Once that's done, grab your polyfill and it is time to start puffing. Each column should be kind of like a little pocket. So what you're gonna do is take a handful of polyfill, shove it down the column all the way to the bottom row, and do that in every column so that each square in the bottom row has some puff. And you wanna make sure you're adding a lot here because as you wash your quilt over time, you don't want your quilt to get saggy or less puffy. And once all of the squares in the bottom row are fully puffed, you're gonna sew across that first row to close it up and lock everything in place. And you're just gonna repeat this same process all the way up the quilt until you get to the very last seam across the top row of the quilt. Once you've sewn across all of the rows, go up 3 columns again, lock each row into place, and then continue sewing each row. My biggest tip for you here is to pin everything into place really well as you go. Once you get to the top row and you have fully puffed all of the squares in that row, to close it up, you're gonna fold the backing and the top in like you can see me doing here. Pin it all in place so it stays folded and make sure it's folded at the seams as well as in the middle of the blocks, and then take it over to the sewing machine and close up that last row. Once you trim your threads, you have officially made a gorgeous new puff quilt, and now you have something super cozy to snuggle with, and I hope you love it as much as I love mine.